You can go ahead. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Radio Sophia. So after a brief hiatus, Radio Sophia is back to hosting some of the most insightful sessions and discussions plaguing the society, the polity, and the economy. And in this entire period, the world has actually experienced several upheavals, and it certainly has an effect on that organ of our body, which has to work tirelessly day in and day out. And eventually, as we often say, the mind goes nuts. And talking about nuts, we are proud and privileged to host amongst us the author of the book, Beneath the Walnut and its Almond Chamber, Mr. Hariram, for a session titled, Depressed Because the Brain Thinks We Like It. Mr. Ram is an alumnus of the London School of Economics and currently serving as the director in Deloitte. We are fortunate to have him spare his invaluable time from his very busy schedule. And we hope by the end of the session, we would get to know our invisible friend, the brain, as Mr. Ram puts it in his book, much better than we know now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Himatri. That was a very good introduction, especially given the context of what the world has been through the past couple of years, and in some parts of the world, even worse with wars going on. Thank you, everyone. My name is Hariram, and I've been quite passionate about self-awareness. I stayed away from religion or religious beliefs in identifying what could be the truth behind life. I went through science and logic. I went through the process of negation to actually identify what is it that drives all of us, and it led me into understanding one of the most important organs in the body, which is the brain, and it also remains one of the most I would say the studies on the brain have recently commenced in early 2000s, and therefore there is much to learn about the brain. Now, you ask any neuroscientist, they will be just baffled by the brain. It's just full of surprises, and it's one of the most marvelous things ever discovered in the universe. And based on my understanding and process of self-awareness, my challenge was to pattern and say, okay, is the brain so complex? What does the brain, after all, do? And I realized that it's actually very simple when it's working. There is input through your eyes, your ears, your smell, your touch. It's simply processed by the brain, and there is a logical output recommended by the brain. So all things like your happiness, your ecstasy, your your confusion, your anger is all an offshoot of potentially very logical processes. And at first I couldn't believe it, right? And I said, okay, it could not be the case, but let's, I wanted to actually try and see if it was the case. So during my journey of self-awareness, I used myself as a guinea pig to really understand, can the brain be so simple and it's working? And it did turn out to be that the brain is actually a very simple organ. Now, one of the challenges that I had, I've read a lot of psychology books and a few neuroscience books. My challenge was to simplify memory and make it accessible or understandable by the common man. So therefore, I came up with very simple definitions of memory, which is we make memories of our interactions with ourselves and the outside world, which is I for Hari, you for yourself, and there's the world around us, right? So there are primarily two kinds of things. One is internal memory, which mainly denotes the self, the ego, one's inner world, if you will. And then there is the external memory, which is beings and things in the outer world. Now, for instance, my spouse, my children, or my friends will be external. But for me, Hari is an internal entity for me. So therefore, any experience that Hari has will be internal, and any experience that I have with the external world will be external memory. Now, the brain categorizes memories depending on the frequency of use. Now, frequency of use is how often, how frequently do I use? And here there are primarily two kinds. One is working memory, which is I need it, I need it because I frequently use it. And then there is distributed memory, where I infrequently use it. It means I've not used that memory for quite some time. An example of a frequent memory would be the names of my children, the names of name of my spouse, the home I live in, the name of my colleagues, etc. And distributed memory would be a long forgotten friend in kindergarten, right? And things that we don't remember often, the brain automatically pushes it out. Now, when I try to map these four memories on a matrix, when it came to external memory, I realized that the brain actually does automatic consolidation, meaning if I haven't used a memory for long, it says, okay, fine, this guy has not used his memory, so let's push it out to distribute it. Now, if I happen to, use a memory very frequently, then it retains it in working memory. Examples of those would be, my home address, my office address, the name of my children, my spouse. I took that example already. So therefore, these memories are essentially retained in working memory because I use them quite often. Now, when it comes to internal memory, it's most what I discovered, based on my experiments was that most of it is actually in working. Because imagine a folder structure, a very logical folder structure. I mean, take a step back and say, think from the perspective of the brain. The brain creates, various different folders. I mean, it's like, we can use the folders as analogies to understand how brain categorizes and stores memories. Now, if I have an experience with a friend called A, now any experience that I have or any experience that I want to have with A will potentially be tagged to the folder, will be the, tagged to the folder called A. Now, anything that I want to experience will be tagged to the folder called Hari. And as I keep using Hari all the time, it's very difficult for the brain to consolidate it to distributed memory because the brain cannot live without Hari, because Hari is one of the core experiential memories that this entity after birth has acquired as a process of conditioning. And therefore, it always remains in working memory and its entire affiliation. So whatever, Hari has experienced or Hari wants to experience or has experienced in the past stays in working memory. Now, the automatic consolidation is not possible by the brain unless I want to do it. First of all, I need to know that, okay, the brain does not do it automatically, which is why one's ego grows over time. One feels, heavy over a period of time, completely stressful. And then you take a vacation, you don't think of certain things, you're back fresh. So during that period, what happens is that the brain kind of pushes out the memories that it thought were important for the person. It pushes it out to distribute it. It says, okay, this person is not thinking about it anymore. Maybe it's not important for him, right? So it gradually pushes out. But then when I'm back to the grind, everything comes back again. So I feel, okay, I felt wonderful while I was on a vacation, but when I'm back at work or back doing something in the corporate world, I mean, the stress, again comes back at companies because those memories become important again for us because we recall them every day. And the brain thinks, yes, all of this is important and pushes it back to working. The consolidation into distributed is possible. This is the crux of the presentation. So let's move forward and see how we can do that. Now, one of the core elements, to my work was to interpret or rather reinterpret time. What is time actually? Now, there are my great definitions of time on the internet and written by various scholars, and I'm not getting into that. But from a psychological perspective, there is a past, there is a present, and there is a future. Fairly common knowledge. Right? It's important to note that we actually learn time as children. Right? So during the ages of 5 to 7, we spent a lot of time memorizing the clock and calendar. If you notice children who are toddlers between the ages of 3 to 5, and then children who are 6 and above, or probably 7 and above, you'll find a stark difference in the way they behave. What is that one major factor that has influenced their behavior is that they have begun to understand time as linear, right? And then it helps it helps to predict the future, right? It helps to predict what comes ahead. And as we move along to mid-age, it's actually we are actually trying to unlearn time and actually trying to live in the moment, which becomes impossible for us. Now, it's important to note that time is actually a human construct. It's not a universal declaration. It's actually a human construct, and it's, as I told you earlier, it's actually a factor of early age conditioning. Now, how does the brain use time physiologically, or rather, how does it store time physiologically? Now, everyone knows that uh, memories are formed or retained in the form of neuronal synapses, where neurons fire and connect with each other and create memories accordingly. Now, when we actually look at it, the reality is that the time is actually they're disjointed. Memories are actually disjointed stacks with timestamps. Now, have you observed how time is used on a computer? Time is used on a computer, especially when you look at a folder system or a file system. It remains as a timestamp, right? It was edited or created at this date, edited at this date, etc., etc. Similarly, we have, we remember an experience. We remember having experienced something at this point in time. But essentially, it becomes a memory point. But if you take away time away from it, everything is a disjointed stack of experiences, which is one of the reasons why we are actually able to correlate and disregard time and correlate experiences very easily. Now, everyone knows about the subconscious mind. Um, the subconscious mind is something that we cannot really understand easily, right? It works. I mean, some people in the past have tried to say that the subconscious mind is actually wired against the person, or it kind of tricks the person, etc. But based on my understanding, it's actually subconscious is basically a function of working memory delivered at top speed. Now let's see how that happens. Now 1 second of time, which is 1 second of a block of time, it's too little for us. Right? We can't even fathom living in 1 second, but it's a lot of processing time for the brain. It can do marvelous things within 1 second. So the one truth is the brain works extremely fast. Now there are micro loops of thought within a second. Now there is a very, very logical, object-oriented working memory retrieval and a logical output which is fragmented fast. The process of thought, I'm sure all of you may know this, once you have a sensory input, it's processed through memory, primarily working memory, and then there's a logical output which is produced. Now, distributed memory is invoked only when the what we need to perform the particular task is not within working memory. Now, we may not, like for instance, let's assume that there was a complex formula that you learned in school, and you need to apply it all of a sudden. Now you don't remember it, of course, but your working memory has other memories that are required for you to live life live life daily. That formula is not required to live life is not actually critical for your daily living, so the brain has pushed it out. Now you immediately will not have an output. You will need to scan through your brain, and then the brain returns, okay, this is the formula. And this is how the process also works when you've forgotten the name of a childhood friend. And then 5 minutes later, all of a sudden you get the name. So you've registered an instruction to recall that particular name, and the brain scans through distributed memory and suddenly pops up that particular name. So that essentially how thought functions. Now, whenever there is a logical output produced using working memory, the person rides on and acting that particular output. Right? He says, okay, fine, I need to do this. This is what doesn't mean he's not even aware that the brain is doing it. That's the best part of it. It just gets an instinctive input that I've got to either be angry at the situation or I've got to be frightened of the situation, and then the person acts using that output. Now, riding on that output sends positive signals back to the brain. Now let's pause here a bit. It's like if you think your brain, imagine your brain as an executive assistant, right? The brain says, okay, this is the situation you're in. You got to do this. You got to be angry because you were angry in in similar situations in the past, and then say, okay, fine, you got to be angry. I'm making you angry. But then if I get angry, what is the executive assistant going to think? I recommended him to be angry, and he became angry, and therefore I've served him well. So it sends a positive signal back to the brain that it served well. And these micro loops of thought, I mean, a lot of thoughts, happen within a span of 1 second. A lot of thoughts come in. We're not really aware of it. That's why we call it subconscious. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll come to it as to why we are not so easily aware of it. And then, after I, dispense my anger, I realized that, okay, I shouldn't have been angry about it. So therefore, you always perceive that, okay, my actions were actually undesirable when you potentially reflect. Now, some takeaways from here. With its speed and agility, the brain's actually trying to help, not mislead. Right? It's actually trying to help the person if you closely observe it. It has only one purpose, which is to serve you well. Second, working memories are invoked first before decision making, before invoking distributed memories. This is very logical. Third, all our negative outputs like stress, anger, guilt, etc., are all logical recommendations influenced by the content of working memory. Essentially, if I don't have the right input, my output is obviously going to be wrong. So it doesn't mean that the entire processor is wrong, right? It means that the input is wrong. So the rest of the presentation essentially focuses on understanding, how we kind of churn input. Now, coming to the topic of depression. Now, if you apply this logic to understanding depression, depression is actually very logical cycles of thought. Remember this memory matrix, I put it here for reference. Now let's begin here. Let's run a flow chart. Now there is towering amounts of information that we scan. We look at a lot of information that we process in every second. First, it's processed through the gateway, which is your ego. It's processed through that, and then there is a judgment made. There is a logical judgmental question asked: is this information needed, useful, or needed? If it is not needed, it pushes it to quadrant 3, because anything that the ego needs, anything that the self needs, is retained in the self. So anything, like for instance, I'll put an example here. Let's imagine you're sitting in front of a tree, but thinking of a job that you've applied for, or thinking of how to write my thesis, right? So the tree, although you're looking at the tree will go to distributed memory because you're not reacting to the tree. The object of contemplation, which is either thinking about a job or thinking about how to write the thesis, will stay in working memory, right? So it's essentially whatever we observe and whatever is not needed, it gets pushed out to quadrant 3, pushed out to distributed memory. Now, if the information is needed, now there are two parts to it. Right? This is where let's spend some time here because it's very confusing. Information is pleasant or dislikable. There's one scenario. The second scenario is information is unpleasant or dislikable. Now, both are two sides of the same coin. Right? So this is very important to note. Now, it's like saying I like to dislike something. It's like I like an apple versus I like an apple not. Right? So both likes and dislikes actually receive the same level of attention. Same level of attention. So anything that you like or anything that you dislike is retained as useful information. Right? And when we react to the environment, we sometimes may say, okay, fine, I don't like the look of it, or I don't like the look of this particular thing. I guarantee you that particular memory will be stored in working memory because the brain would want to warn you of similar situations in future, right, to avoid it. Right? So this new useful information from the perspective of the brain. So even what you want to avoid is useful information. So think of this from the brain's perspective, not from your perspective. Think of it from the brain's perspective. It needs to keep track of what you like and what you dislike at the same time. Right? And everything is retained in working memory for future use. Now, most of this useful needed information are actually indexed to the ego or self, right? Which is you who are reacting. It is I who is reacting. It is I who don't like something. It is I who like something. So therefore, it is indexed to the logically indexed to the ego. Now, at very rapid intervals, these imagined realities, like for instance, if I say I want this job, or I want to write this thesis well, or I want to go for a vacation in Switzerland next year, all these are imagined realities. It could be a positive reality or a negative reality, which is a negative reality will be, oh my God, I'm going to be doomed, right? These are all processed at rapid intervals. Same again, a judgmental analysis is made as to whether the imagined reality is equal to actual or likely reality. Now, in case if it's yes, it makes the person happy and there is positive contemplation. Take a situation where you applied for a job through a referral, and and you talk to your referee, and your referee says, "Don't worry, you're one of the best candidates. You'll get the job." Right? You haven't walked into the interview. Nothing has happened, but you're happy because there is positive contemplation in you that yes, I will. Then you start planning, how will I make the interview? How will I crack the interview? How will I get this job? How will I make a difference? And blah, 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 right? So all this is positive contemplation. Now, negative contemplation, when it comes to know if the imagined reality is not the likely reality, it's perceived as a threat. The brain goes, does one step, it kind of goes one step beyond and decides that it is a threat and triggers an emergency response in your body with a lot of enzymes, which results in stress and anxiety. And then you engage in negative contemplation, which is, oh my God, I haven't got this job. What am I going to do? What will my friends think about me? What will my parents think about me? All the negative contemplation starts. Okay? All these is actually reimagined, right? So these new imagined realities are reimagined with new variations, right? And then re-indexed back to the self. Now, this process, which is from, if you look at the process, the 7, 8, 9, and 11, and back to 7, and 7, 8, 10, 11, and 7, it leads to toxic positivity and stress and anxiety. And these run at absolute rapid speed, keep on running in the brain. And this phenomenon was discovered in the early 2000s, and the neuroscientists called it default mode network. It's famously called DMN, or it's called a default mode or a default network mode, interchangeably. The person is sitting in the sofa or sitting on a chair doing nothing, no physical activity, but he's thinking, he or she is thinking a lot of things like, what am I going to do tomorrow? I shouldn't have done that in the past. You will go repair the past. You will again go create a scenario. Had I not been angry, things would have been better. Right? Had I not said this, things would have been better. But we're going and trying correcting the past, which is no use. Right? And similarly, you're trying to say, okay, what are others thinking of us? Am I in the good books of my boss, or am I in the good books of my colleagues, or am I in the good books of my fellow students? There's a lot of contemplation that keeps going on, and there's no physical action. Right? You're sitting in a chair doing nothing. Right? You can even still be watching a movie and thinking about something. Right? So it could have happened to all of us in different points in time. So where our mind is thinking about something else, even when you're sitting in a movie theater. That's how the default mode actually works. And there's some activity that auto triggers and keeps working. It's still a mystery for many people to actually understand how the brain does this. Now, when a person observes this particular pattern, the person is actually unaware of ego accumulation due to the brain's numbness. Now, remember I told you that there are some features of the brain due to which we're not able to observe it very, very clearly. It's because the brain is actually numb. It's a numb organ. You can, during neurosurgery, the anesthesia is given for the scalp and the skull, and you may take a needle and poke inside the brain. The person will have no feeling. Right? It's a numb organ. It does not process it. It processes pain for the rest of the body, but it is a painless organ. It cannot feel anything. So you could take your hand, squeeze your brain out, you wouldn't feel anything. Right? It's a marvelous design if you come to think of it, because just imagine if every thought resulted in an itch, we'll all be scratching to glory. Right? So it's a marvelous design. It's a fantastic design if you come to think of it. The brain retains and uses the accumulation in quadrant 1, thinking the person needs it. There's no two ways about it. Whatever I react to as I like and dislike is all tagged to me. I keep accumulating it in my folder unknowingly, right? And then most of these imagined realities are actually impertinent to the daily tasks and hinder productivity. Right? Now, for instance, I may want to work on my thesis or may want to work on my deliverable, but suddenly I may think about, going and go on a, thinking spree about, think about something which is absolutely impertinent, right? Something that's not relevant to the situation at all. So the brain gets hijacked. Why does it get hijacked? It gets hijacked because of working memories, because the brain thinks they are important for you. Think of it as, reminders on your Outlook or Google suddenly popping up every time that you've set up meetings but not attended them. It just keeps popping. Right? So that's what's happening in the brain. It, as a dispassionate executive assistant, it is trying to remind you that you've loaded all these things to experience, or you want to do it. So please go ahead and do it. Just reminding us. And in the process, we feel stressed. Now, when a person observes this particular pattern, now here is where we need to be careful, and we need to actually understand who's the observer. Right? So when you are able to observe all this activity, including the activity of yourself independently, who is the person observing? It's actually that natural intelligence in you that is actually observing the person, that is observing this particular activity. Now, that intelligence is there everywhere. It's there around the universe. It's there in everything. It's there in everything that you see. And we are all an embodiment of that. So from that stage of natural intelligence, when we instruct the brain has no other option but to consolidate memories from quadrant 1 to 4. How do we do it? How did we accumulate? We accumulated by the process of speaking, unconsciously rambling within ourselves, unconsciously talking to ourselves. How do we consolidate memories? How do we, trim our, the first quadrant here? Is by consciously talking that I don't need it, rather than saying I dislike it. Right? If you say I dislike it, it stays. But if you say I don't need it, then it potentially, the brain learns that, okay, I kept it thinking he needs it. So, and therefore, he doesn't need it right now. I got a candid instruction, so let me push it out. It's important, it's actually, that's the crux behind the ancient practice of meditation, of different forms that we have in society today, is to be observant of our thoughts. And what to do with it? To actually react or not react. If we react to it, the brain says, it's important, because we recall it. If we don't react to it, which means the brain thinks we don't need it, and therefore it pushes it out. Right? That's the logic behind our meditative practice as well. And once when, over a sustained period of time, when we're able to kind of maintain our ego and ourselves with the right amount of memories to function, there will be enhanced productivity. There's no other outcome. There's no other, there's no escaping that particular truth. It will lead to productivity. Right? Think of it, non-productivity is actually productivity from the brain's perspective, because for the brain, it does not matter whether it's positive productivity or negative productivity. For the brain, it's processing capacity that matters. And it will process anything that we load on. Right? So it is us who, the buck stops at us. We need to be cognizant as to what we load onto the brain. And therefore, also have developed the ability to be observant and also say no, that I don't require it, or this is not important for me. So that's it's a very simple way by which the brain actually works. And I'm keen to kind of have a discussion with you guys. So I wanted to talk for about 30 odd minutes, and then have a discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was very insightful. And I think all of us have learned a lot of new things, especially how we look at brain. So the first thing I want to point out is how you separated the decision-making focus point of brain, and basically told us that it's not the brain making the decisions, but something else. So could you elaborate on that? Who is making the decisions for us, if not the brain?
Yeah, so it's actually there are two parts to it. One is as a process of early age conditioning. We are born nameless, right? So we are born with only the necessary biological memories to function as a human, as a bare entity, right? As a bare organism. Right? I'm not getting into those memories. Those memories are biological memories, which are important for functioning of the body, right? So we're not getting into that. The experiential memories that we gain, one of the first and foremost memories is our name, right? And then we learn time, and then we start imagining ourselves in different points in time, right? We say, okay, when I'm 20, I'll do this. When I'm 40, I'll do this. When I'm 60, I'll do this. When we look at someone successful, we'll say, I want to be like him. When I look at someone not successful, we'll say, I don't want to be like him, like him or her. So therefore, there is no end to the way we are kind of imagining and expanding our ego. It is the brain uses that the intellect, which is the intellect is actually if you come to think of what the intellect is, the closest explanation could be the hippocampal region, which is it is an orchestrator of memories, which is there is an input, and the hippocampus plays the role of orchestrating, pulling different kinds of memories from different places to serve that particular request. It plays the role of that orchestrator. Now, one of the core memories is the gateway of ourselves, which is Hari for me and all of us for ourselves. Now, and we have accumulated, right? We've accumulated a lot of imagined realities. So therefore, there is a mini entity sitting in our brains, right? So within our brains, which is our ego, and that is essentially the gateway through which everything is processed. Right? So that is that becomes a full-blown entity in our brains, and the whole the practice of ancient meditation was to either trim it or totally cut it off, right? So that you can remain your natural intelligent self all the time. Right? So an ego is necessary to the extent we want to identify ourselves to the world. Right? But what happens when we continuously accumulate unknowingly to the ego? The ego becomes a full-blown entity and stays within the brain, and it starts controlling, how this person should live, because it thinks that these things are important for the person. So there's a clear distinction between, the ego and the person who's observing the ego. And that's the whole process of meditation is to kind of get to that and watch the ego impartially.
Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I think you're pretty clear on that. Thank you, sir. So I would like to tell the audience.
Yeah, I have a question from Sumit. Hi, Sumit. If the brain works faster, how amygdala hijack happens, and why not neocortex is engaged straight? Can you elaborate on this, Sumit? I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, hello Hari. So what I want to ask is, what I've understood from the deliberation is that there is a working memory which is developed, and we are born with a minimum level of biological memory. So my question is, we are often hearing that there is a gland in the brain which is working, of course known as amygdala, which is working on its own. So as you see, let us say a snake. So if the memory is built like this, that it is going to bite you, so you immediately either fly or say fright or say freeze. So one of those kind of reactions. So the argument is, and this is the question, the argument is they suggest, so some of the speakers or the scholars suggest to take a pause, engage your neocortex, and probably you will get a better decision, which is a learned decision, as you have also spoken about intellect. So probably you are engaging your intellect and giving a different decision. My question is simple question is, how do you work on this working memory to engage your neocortex and not engage your amygdala or not getting hijacked? Simple.
Understand. Now, regarding amygdala hijack, I have a slightly different view. It's not the amygdala that hijacks. It's what's in the amygdala that hijacks. There's a huge difference between the two. Now, if we have to say amygdala is hijacking, so let's remove the amygdala. There is the actual case in psychology of Henry Molaison. So most of his brain parts were removed. He was not able to make memory so easily, right? So he was not able to function very easily. So therefore, the part is there for a particular reason. The amygdala is also implicated for enduring happiness. Amygdala is also implicated during positive emotions, not just negative emotions. So So therefore, it's not the amygdala that hijacks, it's the information in the amygdala that actually hijacks. Now, look at the, let's kind of look at the brain as a, very logically like a, powerhouse of memory. The outer layer will be, okay, these memories are not so important for the person, distributed memory. Now, within working memory, which is important for the person, they will be, okay, this is moderately important for the person. This is absolutely important for the person. This is critical for the person, right? So the amygdala, essentially, whatever is absolutely critical for the person is processed, by the amygdala. And it essentially appears that the amygdala, the part is hijacking, but it's not the part which is hijacking, in my opinion, my humble opinion. It is that the information contained in that, which is processed by that organ, which is hijacked, which is my personal safety is important. And I've actually talked about this particular snake example in my book as well, which is when we see a dog, we don't react as much. But when we see a snake, we'll be completely, it's because it's a life-threatening situation. Even if the snake has no intent to come near you, we might fantasize that, okay, snake will come to me because it's not in a cage or not in a glass cage, and it might bite me. If it bites, I self-catastrophize myself that, okay, I'm going to die, and all that, right? So all that, because that's how snakes have been introduced to us in human history, right? So you got to be careful about snakes. Oh my God, it might bite you, it might die. So therefore, it's extreme danger, right? So, and that becomes, very, very important information for the brain to retain to ensure personal safety. So which is one of the reasons why we are unable to, as you rightly said, go to the neocortex immediately. But when I sit back and relax and say, oh, hey, is that snake really going to bite me? It's 5 feet away from me. Okay, let me use my intelligence and move away from the snake. Right? So that unfortunately, doesn't come. It comes by practice, which is, yes, immediately there is a threat warning. There is a warning signal. And the brain's job is to give us, make us happy or give us warning signal. So it does. But at that point in time, in case we are aware, that, yes, it's, in case we are aware that, we are being, we've been recommended an act, to actually run away, I can use my intelligence at that particular point and say, hey, don't worry, let's move out, or let's call someone and take the snake away, and let's help give the snake an alternative life. So it's, but we don't, we're not conditioned that way. We're conditioned to, hey, grab a few people, go kill that particular snake, right? So why? Because it might bite all of us, which none of which could be true. So therefore, it's all, based on our, in my opinion, humble opinion, it's based on our human conditioning that we go through during early childhood.
So thank you, Hari. From your last word, and I'm sorry, Kranti and Purushottam, I'm taking a little more time. So maximum 60 seconds on this, sir. So Hari, as you've said, there are a lot of conditionalities. Means, don't you think there are several moderators to the model which you have shown? As in, there could be training, more meditation you have already talked about, situational conditionalities in terms of time and space, in terms of your support system, in terms of your risk-bearing capacity. Those built up, and this is my last question. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed you for the last 10 seconds. Could you repeat that if you don't mind?
So I am saying, where are the moderating factors, say, shown in the model? So you have simply shown us that in previous 2-3 slides that it all depends upon distributing between your working memory and distributed memory, and there is a pattern in terms of depression and or other social phenomena or psychosocial phenomena, wherein the information flows, wherein your reaction flows. But you are also talking about several contingencies, several other variables and factors which are not inbuilt in this model. So how do we factor that?
Yeah, so I've
is it so simple? And if it is so simple, is it same for everybody? Why do we differ, and how do we differ?
Yeah, so we essentially, we differ based on the content of our memories. So the content of our memories and our, typical the way our, this is not a complete science book. So therefore, I have stayed away from going into, say, the DNA aspects of it, but it's more on the experiential part of it to actually, go into the subject of mental health. Now, all of us are different. All of us will react to the same thing in a very different way because of our conditioning. And the way we react is actually, contributing to conditioning. Now, one of the key things to understand is the way we speak to ourselves, right? So the way we speak to ourselves when something good is happening or when something bad is happening, right? So all that is contributing to reconditioning ourselves, right? And we become a new, we are not the same person today, and we will not be the same person tomorrow because of the amount of self-speaking that we do within ourselves. So therefore, experientially, every person is, working in a very different manner, is, and it's attributable to their, to their, working to their, the kind of memories they have imbibed, if you will. Now, is the brain very different in different people? Now, unless there are deformities that people are born with, the normal healthy brain is very similar in working pattern. So, and my, subject matter of, investigation through my book is to kind of understand what is the pattern by which, various emotions are caused, and how people are, essentially, it's the right question that you, asked it. Why are people different, and why people react to, things in a different situation? It's because of, certain, very different memories that they make during early childhood, the kind of conditioning they go through, and every person is, very different, and that's the whole part of, diversity, if you will. The Another important thing to kind of note here is, so when it's important to realize that, okay, when it comes back to the, something of liking and disliking, right? If I dislike a lot of things, if I have absolute apathy towards certain things in life, I condition myself in a very different way versus a person who, let's assume that he likes those things. Now, let's say, for instance, an apple. My son doesn't like an apple. My daughter likes an apple. The moment I take an apple, both of them will have opposite behaviors. Now, does the qualities of the apple change? No, the qualities of the apple remain the same. It's a healthy fruit, but the person is reacting differently because of, maybe they don't like the taste. My son doesn't like the taste. My daughter likes the taste. Right? So I don't go into why one likes and why one dislikes, but try to patternize, especially, coming to our experiential, things, that the kind of, the social programming we go through. So I'm not going into biological programming. I stop at social programming, especially the way we live life in our daily life.
Purushottam Mishra, I think you can go ahead with your question.
I have a question from Aishwarya. Okay, yeah, Purushottam, you can go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, sir. That was a very good presentation by you. Basically, my question is basically a practical question. As you said that if we spot a snake somewhere, so the option is not always to go and kill the snake. We can use our intelligence and we can, consciously try and move away from it. But always, it is not always possible that we can move away from the situation. Suppose we are traveling in a flight and there is some turbulence, and suddenly all these negative thoughts starts creeping in our brain and it opens a Pandora's box. And in that situation, we cannot move out of that. We have no other choice. So my question is, can you suggest some few practical tips that how we can effectively control our thoughts through our conscious intellectual interference?
Yes. Who is contributing to that particular stress? Now, hopefully none of us have to go through, none of us would, I'm just hoping that none of us go through that situation in a flight. But whenever there's a turbulence, there is immediately a trigger response that the flight might crash, right? And then a lot of negative thoughts keep coming in, or rather, a lot of thoughts keep coming in. Let's worry about whether they're negative or positive a bit later. All these are very logical reactions. Just imagine that all these are reminders popping up that if your life is going to, you've just released a kind of a reality that, okay, the flight might crash, and then that information is perceived by the intellect, and the intellect uses the ego, because the intellect is under the control or the influence of the ego, because the ego is is one of the most maximum used, memories in the brain. And when the intellect uses the memories of the ego says, "Oh my God, there's so much for this particular person. It cannot be possible. This will not happen. That will not happen. Oh my God!" Right? All that cloudburst of memories just come in at that particular point. Now, can the intellect be aware, or rather, can you be aware? Right? So, can you as a person, because you are not your intellect as well, because you have an intellect which is a mid part of the brain which orchestrates different memories, and you have a memory which you use so often, that I use so often. I used to, I always used to think I'm Hari, but after my process of self-awareness, I've realized that Hari is just a process of conditioning. He's just a memory. There's nothing more to it. Okay, it's just like an ID card. Right? Let's use Hari whenever it's necessary, but otherwise, I need not, go on kind of garnishing Hari all the time. So the moment you're in that particular situation, um, it's important to kind of take a deep breath and say, it's fine, whatever happens, doesn't matter, right? Really doesn't matter. Now that level of I would say capacity to do that would come when your processing capacity is not under the influence of the ego. Now, if my working memory is full of my ego, whether it's good memories or bad memories or whatever it is, then the brain has nowhere else to, it has to use those memories. It has to use those memories to produce all those outputs. And those outputs result in stress and anxiety. And the contrary to that is, it could be an extreme happiness, right? So, you might, you just heard the news that you got a job, you've got a dream job, and it's extreme happiness. Because how do you get that happiness? Happiness is not because the condition has been satisfied, right? The ego says, "Fine, this guy, ego says, yeah, this person wanted to become somebody, and yes, that is satisfied, and therefore, it makes the person, extremely happy. Right? And on the other hand, it makes the person extremely sad as well. Whenever there is a life-threatening situation, it's a very you've raised an interesting question, which is it kind of it's very difficult for human beings to get to that state of start observing their ego independently, which is essentially the purpose of meditation is to be attentive to your thoughts and realize that that ego is something that has developed as a process of conditioning. Because we live as the ego, the brain thinks the ego is absolutely critical. The moment we disengage from the ego, who disengages? Who's the observer then? The observer is the natural intelligence. Right? So that every scripture of every religion talks about that. So from that field, if we start approaching life, if we start trimming the ego, if we start cleaning up the ego and segregating what is important versus what is not important, I think the ability to to respond to a situation with better intelligence is the only logical consequence.
So you can go ahead and take the question in the chat.
Yes. Is it necessary that a person unaware of the linearity of time would fail to create memories in the first place? Can you elaborate your question, Aishwarya?
Sure, sir. Sir, in the session itself, as you explained in the beginning, that the person first understands the concept of linearity of time, and then eventually the memories are created in his or her mind. So, like, if suppose there is a person who has never read about the concept of time, he has never been taught about it. So, would he or she not be able to have any memories in his mind?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So thanks. I now get what you're saying. It's there is evidence today in the neuroscience community that especially infants, they fire a lot of memories, and those memories also kind of are immediately distributed. They kind of are there in some corner of the brain, but they immediately discard it because it's not important for the person, right? So therefore, the baby's processing capacity always remains fresh. So they are able to do multiple things at the same time, or the way they observe. If you intently observe infants, they have enormous processing capacity, right? Which is why they're able to pick up, learn. And we've also been infants. We've learned incredible amount of things during our childhood. Right? So what happens? The processing capacity is actually available to make memories. Now, when we learn time, so we learn time as something linear, right? So which is where we give birth to something called the future, and we imagine, we kind of realize that there was a past. Sometimes 20 years ago we thought 5,000 years was the latest. Now we know, because of carbon dating and history, that the Earth is much older than what we think it was. So we are able to kind of realize there was a millions of years of evolution, and there will be millions of years of evolution in the future as well. So we are able to kind of think because of the linearity of time. Now, from a psychological perspective, when we learn time, it is not that a person not being introduced to the circular, or rather than the linearity of time, will not make memories. They will still make memories. There are certain tribes, there are certain Hawaiian tribes, there are certain tribes, all across the world, who do not have a past tense in their language, right? So they cannot speak, on the past. Which, if you come to think of it, we may kind of say that, okay, what a funny construct is that? But actually, if you come to think of it, it actually helps you not to kind of and act in the present moment always. Right? So it's not that the person will not make memories. The person will make memories, but those memories will not be indexed to time as a linear field, like how all of us have our living testimonies to our imagined realities indexed in the field of time, which is anyway a learned memory. Now, ego, if you what is a human ego? It's basically impressions of oneself in different points in time. Right? What I was, what I am today, what I want to be tomorrow. What I am today is not of much consequence, because it is always influenced by what I was and what I want to be. Right? So where I was and where I want to go. So time is an inseparable part of all of us, especially when we've learned the concept of linear time. There are still a lot of cultures who do not, accept time as linear, and in fact, our ancient civilization, we kind of we went with circularity of time. Right? So we didn't think time was linear. Linearity of time is a modern, contemporary Western concept, if you will. And there are a lot of civilizations who still understand and and live as if time is actually circular. But if you come to think of it, they're much more happier.
Thank you, sir.
You still make memories.
Sure, sir.
Kranti, you can go ahead with your question.
Hi, thanks, Arunika. Thanks, Hari, for this excellent presentation. It's very insightful, and it's already made me eager to read the book. And also thanks for accepting our invitation to be a part of Radio Sophia today. So my question, what interested me, sort of thinking about ego, do you think a person's intrinsic nature or characteristics, or we say certain attributes, play a role in influencing the ego? By this, what I mean is, let's say a person is stubborn. I started to think that any quality or any characteristic of ours might act like a double-edged sword. In certain situations, our stubbornity might help us in getting what we want, but in certain situations, it might push us to not realize that ego is taking over us, and we might act in a certain way, like you said, from a place of fear, or like that. Or let's say if we characterize a person as being nice, sometimes being nice helps, but sometimes we start saying this person is too nice, and then you are losing in a particular situation. So, so my question is basically, does this play a role in how the ego is making us react to a situation? And is this also a reason where two people might react very differently in very same situation despite having similar?
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kranti. Yes, it kind of, why different people, like for instance, take infants. one infant may like something, one infant may not like the same thing. Why does that happen? We actually don't have enough information to come and say that this is why this person is disliking it or liking it. There's not much information that we can gather on infants at this stage. Now, I take an example of myself, right? So I've come to accept that my son does not like the apple, and I've come to accept that my daughter likes the apple. So therefore, I cut an apple for my daughter, I cut something else for my son, right? So I don't entrust my ego and say, hey, you've got to eat an apple because an apple keeps the doctor away. No, I don't want to do that because he doesn't like it. And his natural intelligence says, am I not supposed to unlike some things? So, right? So I don't like an apple, so I don't like an apple. Why don't you accept it? Right? So yes, that was a great lesson for me as a parent. We all live and learn. So therefore, I've stopped to kind of force him to have apples, even though it's good to have apples. Now, beyond a certain age, right? So we go through a lot of social conditioning, and all of us, in the Indian, we've all, been born and brought up in India in similar circumstances. There's a lot of social conditioning that happens, right? So look at that kid, he's so bright. Look at that kid, he's gone to, MIT, Harvard. Look at you, right? You haven't gone anywhere. You're still struggling and blah, blah, blah. So there's always a kind of, comparison that is made by society. I'm not saying, most parents do, but most of our society actually does, right? So they start comparing ourselves with a lot of, success and even with a lot of failure as to how not to be. So what happens there is we kind of are misguided or we get hijacked by things that we observe in the external world, right? So yeah, he did his MBA, so therefore let me also go do the MBA. Because why? Because MBA earns you earn an MBA, you'll get a better job, and the rest is need not be explained. If someone wants to go do something in social sciences, I've actually heard somebody say, hey, that's a passport to unemployment. Why are you doing it? Right? You won't get it. You won't get anything, because one of my known friends was interested in doing theoretical physics. I say your theoretical physics is absolutely useless unless you want to go into research. Right? So you won't get your job. If you want to get a job, go do engineering, or if you want to get a job, go do chartered accountancy or MBA after that. Right? So that's the way unfortunately, or for whatever, whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, time will tell. But that's the way we conditioned ourselves. So our ego is not just our innate qualities. Now, some things we will like, some things we will dislike. Right? So it's okay. It doesn't matter. So it's to accept. If I happen to be my son, if I dislike an apple, fine. I also dislike certain fruits. It's fine. It does not mean that I have to win over and go and start eating that. It's okay. Our innate qualities cannot change. People are different, right? But the moment we start looking at others and start imbibing things, that he is like that, so therefore I want to be like that. She is like that, therefore I want to be like that. So when we start imbibing those things, those are qualities that get added on, which eventually results in a midlife crisis as we age. Right? So we realize nothing is going right because I really don't like what I'm doing. That's because I have followed another's pattern and not really listened to my own self as to what I want to do. The answer lies within me. So the buck stops with me. So therefore, the more time we spend in accepting that this is the way I am, it's okay. It's okay to like, or it's okay to like certain things. It's okay to not like certain things. I'm different, right? And so are you. You are different, right? And that's the beauty of life. I think the issue starts when we start comparing excessively and patronizing people and follow those patterns. And that's where I think the individual loses the purpose of his own journey, his or her own journey.
Do we have any more questions, or I can ask my question then? All right. So I have a very small question, sir. And the since the discussion started with the idea of addressing depression, we see that there are a lot of schools of thought when it comes to treating depression. So somebody believes in nutrition, somebody believes in routine, somebody believes in prescribing pills, and then there are Gen Z who believe in doing weed to get rid of depression. So considering that brain is a processing machine, how do these different activities affect the brain, and how do all these roads lead to treatment of depression in the end? And is there something called as free will in all this process, which eventually leads to the light at the end of the tunnel for a person?
Understand. Got it. Thank you. When it comes to say taking, I mean, there are many ways to treat depression. I'm not a trained psychotherapist or a psychologist, so therefore I will refrain from going too technical. But broadly, as an observer, one is depression that is clinically treated, and then there is self-treatment for depression, accepted means, and then there is other means like what you said, either taking drugs or alcohol or getting rid of depression. Now, when it comes to clinical depression, understand that there are monitored dosages that are monitored to actually reduce the activity in the brain. So the brain's design, if you come to just a second, it's basically the medial temporal lobe, which is the mid part of the brain, is actually closely coupled to the frontal cortex, which is the processing kind of processing area. Now, in a normal adult, the processing area processes the information contained in the mid portion, the mid part of the brain, right, which is the working memory area. Now, there is a natural way to kind of observe it and kind of clean up this particular medial temporal lobe and make sure that my processing capacity is not hijacked. So, which is the process of meditation. Now, what happens in in clinical depression when they take pills or when the coupling between these two organs kind of reduces. They decouple. They're not coupled, so they decouple. So when they decouple, they suddenly feel relieved because my processing capacity is not under the influence of my past memories anymore. So when we take a few pegs of alcohol, that's what happens. So it actually, the coupling reduces, and therefore there's suddenly, gush of energy, and in weed it's multiplied, multifold, if you will. So effectively, I know taking, subscribing to, self-medicated means of, getting into thinking that, okay, this will relieve me of my depression, either taking alcohol or weed, is not recommended because it damages the brain. Because then it becomes a habit. There's no natural capacity to clean up the brain, because I'm then drawn to, it becomes a habit. I'm drawn to that particular weed to continue, wanting for it. So it doesn't help at all. It in fact damages the brain, and it's very difficult to come out of it. Now, during clinical depression, very minor dosages of such with medicines are administered to the person to the extent that the person feels relieved. And then when the person feels relieved, it is the process of reflection that takes over. It is the process of dialogue that takes over. Right? So first, I need to get the person to listen. Completely a clinically depressed brain, it's very difficult to get their attention because they're always hijacked by their own memory. They just cannot come out of it. So therefore, a small doses of medicines are given to reduce the coupling between the processing capacity, processing area, and this, so they feel relieved, and then a dialogue can start. Right? And when a dialogue starts, that dialogue is the healing process, not the pill. Right? So therefore, when you observe meditation in a very scientific manner, it's actually an inner dialogue that you're having with yourself. It's basically the real you having a dialogue with a smaller you, right? And conditioning the smaller you, because the smaller you is completely hijacked my life.
Thank you for that answer, sir. Just last question perhaps, and it's basically, I want to ask, what is the role of sleep when it comes to the maintaining the health of our brains? Is it true that we need 8 hours of sleep, or is it something called as a fully restful sleep, and that is all we need in order to maintain our brains?
Okay, got it. Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. I hope everyone's okay on time. I think we've passed 5 minutes. I'm okay to continue for another 5 to 10 minutes. I hope that's okay for you guys. Okay, great. So when you sleep, okay, let me give you an analogy. You would clean your desk, of, on your study desk, you clean it, make it ready for the next day. Or if you're cooking, you'll clean the kitchen, keep it ready for the next day, keep things back in its place, right? The brain does the similar thing with memories. That's when you're sleeping. When you're sleeping, the brain is simply consolidating memories. Did the person use this memory? Because everything that the person responded to is actually retained in working memory. But then when the person is sleeping, the brain consolidates memory as to whether this is important or not important. He was stressful about his job. He has been stressful about his job, and he has to go to the job tomorrow as well. And therefore, this is important. That stress of the job will reside in working memory always. Right? He met a kindergarten classmate in his WhatsApp group after 20 years, and they chatted like they kind of they chatted for almost 2 hours. Is this important? Maybe not, because he hasn't been in touch for 20 years. So therefore, it could go to borderline distributed memory unless and until you kind of decide to further that friendship on a daily basis. Then that person comes back to working memory. Right? It retains in working memory. So the brain asks this important question as to whether is this memory important for the person? Is this memory not important for the person? Anything not important is pushed out to distributed. Anything important is retained. So all that memory reconsolidation happens when you sleep, which is why after a good sound sleep of 8 hours, which is recommended, we feel fresh. Right? We feel fresh, and maybe after a couple of hours, the stress comes back again, right? Because those memories indicating stress have not gone away, because the brain thinks it's important for us and retains it. So the ego thinks it's important, it's there in the ego. Now, before we sleep, if we review the day, right, and I've actually tried this, and I've requested a few friends to try this, and it actually works, which is, imagine you had a bad experience with someone. After that incident has happened, we might come back, we curse that person is cursing us, all sorts of things happen, right? So we're not, that event has long happened. I mean, the event happened in the afternoon, but I'm still thinking about it. Now, if I sleep like that, tomorrow when I meet the person, totally different day, totally different, environment, totally different situation, the brain will just fire an instruction to go pick up the fight. I guarantee you this. It will say you fought, so therefore you need to continue the fight, because it's just warning you that, hey, you are walking into a situation that is not desirable. It's doing its job perfectly well if you come to think, right? Because it understands that you don't like the person. But before going to sleep, if I were to recall that experience and say, hey, he acted in that way because of their circumstances, which is different, which is not necessarily my circumstances. Yes, both of us fought, but we've also been good friends. Why not forgive, right? Or why not forget? Right? It's not important. So tomorrow I'll go apologize to the person. And if you come to think of it, saying sorry is one of the most hardest things in this world. Right? We don't say sorry so easily. We say, okay, you can easily go say it, but a real sorry is the most difficult thing to do, most difficult thing to say, a genuine sorry. Right? It requires absolute guts. If you're able to talk back to that experience and say, okay, it doesn't matter, I will go apologize, I will come to I will make good, I will make sure that this doesn't affect us anymore, and you sleep. Next day when you're meeting him, right, your reaction to him will be entirely different, or him or her will be entirely different, because the brain, yes, remembers the negative experience, but also remembers that you have to, kind of go and patch up. Right? But if you hadn't consciously spoken that I need to patch up, it doesn't, it thinks that, okay, you want to still fight. Right? So I know this is, it might be very difficult for us to do, but this is one of the reasons why a lot of, in a lot of, you know, social and religious practices, there is a concept of prayer before bedtime, or Thanksgiving before bedtime, right? Or or doing some kind of, stating some kind of mantra before bedtime, which is essentially cleaning up the brain, or rather, recollecting what all I did today. Whether you want to, think of God and thank him or her for the wonderful life, and say I had these experiences, but I don't want to remember these experiences tomorrow, or or I want to forgive him, or I want to make good whatever bad I've done, etc. All these are memories to ourselves, or are the instructions to the brain as to how the brain should consolidate the memory. Right? It's very difficult for the average person to actually come and understand as to why these things are important. And if you look at villages in India, they used to have, even today, there is a lot of places where the panchayat usually happens, right? We don't find that in cities anymore, right? So where people congregate in that particular circular area, usually on a, built around a large tree, you have dance performances, you have conflicts resolved before bedtime. That's a wonderful system where people congregate and people talk to each other and go to bed. When they talk to each other, absolute competitors during the daytime. They have competed ruthlessly during daytime, but in the evening they hug each other and go, right? Tomorrow's a new day. We'll deal with it, but you don't carry the enmity. Right? So it's a wonderful system by which you're able to kind of talk to each other, console each other, and then go to sleep. So next day is magically fresh. So what has happened is we have just spoken back to our own brains through the conversation as to how to consolidate. I may be burning with my ego and says, how can he say this? Tomorrow I'm going to go bash him up. But some elder in the society will come and say, it's okay, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I mean, it's all important for you to, to have a calm ego. So everything will be all right. He'll call that person whom you want to bash, and we'll make both of you hug each other, right? And then you go back. So what happens there is you've essentially refired a memory that I don't want to remember the negative experience. So our ancient system is not as unpopular or as we think it to be. It's actually one of the most well thought of systems.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Ram. We have a concluding question for you. So, is it possible then that we can negotiate with our brains instead of ordering it around or fighting with it?
The negotiation happens as long as the ego is taken control. Right? Fighting happens as long as the ego is under control. Right? So here is a larger you, and here is a smaller you. The larger you wants to do something, the smaller you says, no, I think you have to do this, right? And then there is a lot of conflict that happens. Now the smaller you is just an identity, and it has accumulated thinking that the larger you needs all that. Because if you, from the perspective of the smaller you will say, okay, fine, you've been thinking about it all, you've been saying a lot of things, so I've been, making an impression of all that, right? I'm an impression of you. I am, the smaller you says, I'm an impression of you. If both of them were to have a dialogue, the smaller you is just a reflection. It is just that the larger you does not know what he has loaded onto the smaller you. It's actually no need to fight, no need to have a negotiation, nothing. You just need to realize that the brain is there to serve us, and we just need to understand how it works. So it's talking back to ourselves, cleaning ourselves psychologically. It's a beautiful process when you actually get into that whole process. Unfortunately, that process is is called, it's kind of, I would say, painted with a lot of spiritual pain that one has to undergo, but it's nothing of that sort. It's a very fundamental, thing that one should start doing in life, because we take care of every other organ of the body. We don't take care of it as much as we want to, but in case there's something wrong, we go running to the doctor. But with the brain, we just don't know what is wrong. Right? That's because it's a painless organ. We don't know what we accumulate. So if we are conscious that the brain is actually a mirror of what we accumulate, and just throwing back things at us, a marvelous executive assistant, we don't fight with an executive assistant. Right? We fight with an executive assistant because the executive assistant is so strong, and he or she thinks that no, this is not what you require. You require something else. But no, we are under the control of that. No, or rather, we control the executive assistant. We give birth to it. Right? As we just need to kind of come out of it, come out of the brain, which is our natural self, and then start making changes. And how do we make changes? By consciously talking the right things. Simple things like saying, I don't need it. If you dislike something, start saying I don't need it rather than saying I dislike it. Right? That makes a huge difference.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm sure your insights are something we will be using at every juncture of our lives going forward. And thank you so much for joining us at Radio Sophia today. We hope that we get a chance to host you again very soon with your new book coming up. All the best for that. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions for sir, you can leave that in the chat box of the YouTube link, which we will be sharing with you very soon. Thank you all. With this, we come to the end of the session.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It was lovely interacting with you. And here are my contact details. You can feel free to reach out, and we can have a discussion offline as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Aranika. Thanks, everyone.